Hello, and welcome to week 2 of Ethical and Professional Conduct in Behavior Analysis. Today, I want to talk about some the contextual issues around ethics. I think sometimes we get confused between ethical issues, moral issues, legal issues, and I believe it's important to understand the differences among those issues and how they're common, because clearly moral issues and legal issues can influence some of our ethical, they can place us in different kinds of ethical dilemmas. So just let's define them first. Ethical issues refer to a code of conduct adopted by a profession to increase that organization's chances for survival. So ethical issues have to do with what are the things that society needs to expect from us. Moral issues have to do with personal beliefs based on one's philosophies or religious beliefs, and legal issues are laws. They're state and federal laws. Now, in terms of how they are different, moral codes or issues are usually stricter than ethical codes and laws. So, for example, depending on what your moral beliefs are, they could theoretically affect every aspect of your life, from what clothes you put on when you get up in the morning, to how you interact with people, to the kinds of job, the type of job that you have, to what time you go to bed at night. Ethical codes really focus just on our professional work. So in our case, the ethical code would focus on our life as a behavior analyst. And then finally, legal issues are the least prohibitive because they just deal with law. So, for example, it may be an moral violation, depending on what your own moral code is, to think badly or to hope that something bad happens to someone who has wronged you or someone that you don't like. That is not a violation of the ethical code of standards, and it certainly isn't a violation of any laws. Similarly, it is an ethical violation in the Professional and Ethical Compliance Code for behavior analysts if you attempt to intentionally mislead someone by overpromising what a behavioral intervention or a behavioral program that you're associated with can do for their loved one, and not talking about what the potential risks are. On the other hand, sort of overselling or trying to sell a product or something is not necessarily against the law, and so you're not going to be violating any laws. You would be violating the Professional and Ethical Compliance Code for behavior analysts, and depending upon what your personal code of ethics is, your moral code, you may or may not be violating moral codes. So moral codes, the bottom line is moral codes tend to be the strictest. Ethical codes, a little bit less strict because they just focus on our actions as a behavior analyst. And then legal codes, laws, are the least prohibitive. However, penalties for violating those also vary. So what are the penalties for violating a moral code? Well, you feel guilty if you don't do some of the things or you violate a particular code, but that's about it. What are the penalties associated with violating an ethical code? Well, you can get sanctioned by the board, or you could actually have your certification suspended, or you could lose it permanently. On the other hand, violate a law and you could pay a substantial fine, or even worse, you could do jail time. So the point of all of this is you have to keep these various issues, moral, ethical, and legal, in mind, because clearly moral and legal issues can affect or place you in some ethical dilemmas that you might have you might be facing, and we'll talk about more of those examples as the semester goes on. All right, Chapter 2 in Bailey and Birch. Bailey and Birch do a nice job of talking about some basic moral principles that underlie our culture at large and affect our ethical principles. Now, these underlying moral principles, so again, how morals affect ethics, are aspirational goals. So they're not enforceable rules per se, but I think these core ethical principles, as I would call them, these underlying moral principles of our ethical standards, first of all, they're common to all helping professions: nurses, psychiatrists, doctors, excuse me, pharmacists, psychologists, applied behavior analysts. Share these common ethical principles, and they help to assist us in arriving at ethical courses of action. So, as I mentioned, Bailey and Birch discuss some of those. I'm going to talk about the ones that are specifically associated with the American Psychological Association. So these are the core ethical principles around for psychologists. But again, these are common principles, moral principles that I believe can be very useful when we do encounter ethical dilemmas, of going back to, okay, what are some of the basic principles that these ethical standards have been based on? Okay, the first one is benevolence and non-malfeasance. So basically this boils down to the underlying goal of applied behavior analysis and the professional and ethical compliance code for behavior analysts is that we strive to benefit others. However, in our attempt to try to improve the lives of others, at least we don't do any harm. And that is an ethical dilemma that many of us face throughout the course of being an applied behavior analyst. That is, at what point is not doing a treatment going to be in the individual's best interest? Sometimes continuing to do a treatment can result in more harm than not having a treatment at all. We're going to as a behavior analyst, you are going to encounter many ethical dilemmas. And that isn't bad because that just means you're doing your job. You're going to encounter situations where, gee, nothing seems to be working. In fact, everything I'm doing seems to be making things worse. Do I try another treatment? Do I stop? Do I refer to someone else? I've gotten a referral of someone who has, say, for example, a feeding problem. Well, I'm not really an expert in feeding. I've observed some people doing behavioral feeding interventions. I've read some articles. I could go read some more. Do I take this case myself? Do I refer them to somebody else? It may take months for someone else to get involved, or there's no one in my area. On and on. These are all the ethical dilemmas that we face really on a daily basis. And since the steps that we will continue to talk about throughout this course, to the point that probably they'll get annoying to you. And so I apologize in advance for that. But I think it's important is that when we encounter an ethical dilemma, that number one, we're able to identify what are the codes, the specific codes that are relevant to that particular dilemma, and what would my action be. But since the compliance codes can be somewhat vague, it's also important to talk to other people. I think something that is very valuable is to have a senior BCBA that you can trust, that you can talk to about ethical dilemmas and help you to weigh this particular issue. What is going to benefit this individual more and decrease the likelihood that at least I'm not going to do any harm. All right, so another issue that comes up in this whole issue of benevolence and non-malfeasance in terms of core ethical principles that I think is critically important is when conflicts arise, behavior analysts attempt to resolve them in a responsible way. People don't like when other people make excuses for when problems occur. So, for example, politics is a great example of that. We see it over and over again. A politician makes a bad decision, or a celebrity, or someone who's a high-profile person makes a bad decision. Instead of saying, I made a bad decision, here's what I'm doing to decrease the likelihood that I will make a bad decision like this in the future, which I think most people then would move on and say, okay, we're done with that. They make excuses. They blame other people. And that blaming, that making excuses, that not taking responsibility becomes a bigger issue than whatever it was that they did in the first place. So back to a BCBA kind of example. If you were responsible for writing a behavior support plan for an individual, let's say a student in a school, and so you met with the parents and you said, yep, here's the plans when he engages in self-injurious behavior. Here is exactly what the staff are going to be doing, and I want you to do the same thing at home. It's really important that this be consistent. So he understands these are the things that are going to be occurring. Well, then the parents come to you 2 weeks later and say, I was picking up Billy the other day, and I noticed he engaged in self-injury several times, and the staff didn't respond the way they were supposed to. And you're telling me we need to be consistent, but yet you're not being consistent yourself. Well, as a behavior analyst, you very likely may have trained the staff, but it turns out that there was a staff shortage, there were some floaters that were in, those people didn't get trained by you, no one told you that there were floaters that were in the classroom working with Billy today. So it would be easy for you to say, well, no one told me. I trained the people that I had. I trained everybody, but there were float staff that were working today. So, well, that's not going to make the parents feel comfortable, and it's not going to help Billy. Taking responsibility to resolve a conflict does help everyone to feel more confident. So instead of making an excuse that, well, no one told me that there were float staff, so I couldn't train them, I think saying, you're right. We had some staff changes. There were people who were working. However, it is working with Billy who hadn't been trained. It is my responsibility to ensure that everybody who works with him is trained and follows the plan. And here's what I'm going to do in the future to ensure that I am aware of any kind of staff changes and that no one who has not been trained by me ever works with Billy again. I think then that's the end of the issue. I think it's incredibly important in terms of professional behavior that we take responsibility and help everyone understand that we can make some changes in order to ensure that these conflicts get resolved. All right, another core ethical principle is fidelity and responsibility related to what we were just talking about, is establishing relationships of trust with those that we work. Again, taking responsibility helps you to establish relationships of trust. And why is that important? Well, again, if remember, ethical guidelines and codes are established to increase the probability that a profession is going to survive. It's going to survive if people believe that behavior analysts are trustworthy. Integrity, related also. Behavior analysts promote accuracy, honesty, truthfulness in science, teaching, and the practice of psychology. Now, again, these are aspirational goals, but there are times when we get in the midst of conflicts, like the one I just mentioned, that I think it's helpful to go back and say, okay, what are our moral roots? And those moral roots are, we are going to promote accuracy, honesty, and truthfulness. We're not going to try to cover things up. Justice is another core element of any ethical codes in the helping professions. So everyone has a right, and those core elements are, everyone has a right to access and benefit from applied behavior analysis, and behavior analysts do not allow personal biases or limits of competence or experience to lead to unjust practices. So again, that is going to be helpful when you're trying to think about an ethical dilemma that involves you maybe doing something that's a bit outside of your comfort level. How you need to make a decision and, as I mentioned, bring in other people to help you make that decision. Can you do some things to increase your competence and therefore you provide those services, or do you need to refer that person out? And of course, part of the answer to that is, okay, what are, and we will be reviewing those, what are the specific compliance codes associated with competence and experience, and what are the alternatives? How quickly can you find someone who has more experience with this particular issue? Are there people in the area? All of those things are going to be relevant. Another core moral principle is respect for people's rights and dignity. So we have to have respect for the rights and dignity of all people, the rights of individuals to privacy, confidentiality, and self-determination. We mentioned this last week, behavior analysts, because we tend to work with the most vulnerable people. We need extra safeguards to ensure that individuals' rights to privacy, confidentiality, and self-determination are provided. And we don't discriminate based on age, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, race. All right. Finally, there's I think, a very interesting chapter that I'm asking you to read in Bailey and Birch on risk-benefit analysis. You'll recall that Cooper talked about ethics addresses 3 questions, and one of those questions is this worth doing? And I think the operational definition to me of whether something is worth doing is the results of a risk-benefit analysis. And that's what Bailey and Birch talk about. I have been talking about these risk-benefit analyses for a couple of years now, and several students have started to actually do them, and I've gotten some tremendous feedback from people saying, this is the best thing I've ever done. So I think this is a very useful tool, and certainly something that is going to prevent you getting involved in some ethical dilemmas moving forward, and certainly consistent with the professional and ethical compliance code for behavior analysts. So Bailey and Birch basically suggest in this chapter that in order to determine is this worth doing, which is the question, that you first assess the general risk factors for behavioral treatment. So what are those risk factors? What are some of the risks? For example, an extinction burst. What are the benefits of the behavioral treatment? And then reconciling with the unique situations and environment of this particular individual and where these behavioral services are going to be rendered, reconciling the risks and benefits with the key parties involved. So I really feel like this risk-benefit analysis is something that can be very useful. I have found it to be useful, and as I say, most people that have come back and talked to me about actually doing some of these themselves have found them to be very useful also. All right, so this week, read chapters 2 and 16 in Bailey and Birch. Read the APA Ethical Principles of Psychologist Preamble and General Principles. So that's just those underlying moral codes, if you will, that I just reviewed. And do the assignment. And the assignment is to conduct a risk-benefit analysis. What I'm looking for is something that's based on figure 16.3 on page 233 of the Bailey and Birch book, for a behavior support plan to decrease tantruming that would include differential parent attention. As usual, if you have any questions that you'd like to, or comments that you'd like to share with everyone, please use the discussion format and comment back to other people's questions or comments, or of course you can always email me. Have a good week, and I will talk to you next week. Bye.